Well, it's good to see you this morning. We do have a number missing, but it's surely a pleasure to see this audience here. And I'm thankful to be with you and among you. We are blessed today to have the opportunity to worship God and serve Him. And we look forward to other opportunities through the Lord's Day. This afternoon, we're scheduled to have our ladies' class. We're scheduled to have our men's class. We're studying the subject of kingdom leaders. And we're on lesson 12. That's the lesson that centers around, I think, the letter to Titus. And so we invite you to come and be a part of that. The men at 3:45, I believe that's right, and the ladies also class at that same time in the auditorium here. And we'd be happy to have you join us and be a part of that. Speaking of leading, I very much appreciate those who have led today and the excellent job that they have done in terms of leading us in songs that have brought us to the praise of God, serving us the supper in a very reverent way, leading us in prayer. It means a lot. I appreciate very much their work also. Speaking of work, let me mention one other thing on behalf of Donald and I. You know, we've just changed quarters, new teachers, new classes started today, and I know both of us feel this deeply, how much we appreciate those who use their talents and take the time and trouble to teach. It is, I think, quite a sacrifice, really. And I appreciate the talents that you have and your willingness to use that for the benefit, whether it be the adult class or the smallest class and all in between. It matters. It makes a difference. It's a precious few minutes that we have in those classes when you compare that with the rest of the week and all the bombardment of the world's messages. And for every teacher, it's just, we owe you a debt of gratitude, and I appreciate you so much. And I know Donald and I both feel that way. I know the church feels that way. I'm thankful for you and for what you do. Let me get to the lesson this morning. Turn to the book of Ephesians, if you will. We've been studying from the book of Ephesians for a little while. We've spent most of those sermons on Sunday night, so this is a little bit out of tune, but we have our singing tonight, and so this is my opportunity today to say something about this subject and to try to bring our minds back to this great book. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul writes there, verse 17, this I say, there we go. This I say, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind. You know, there's a way the world walks, the way the world thinks, and he says, I want to call you out of that. Christ called you out of that. He said in verse 20, he said, ye have not so learned Christ. There are common standards in the world that just are not compatible with Christianity. I'm calling you to be different. Christ called you to be different. So recognize that reality. If we feel at home in this world, there's something wrong with us. And what he does is he gets rather specific about that. And so we're studying right now in latter part of chapter 4 and in chapter 5. There are lists of sins, conduct that just completely opposite of being a Christian. And as we pointed out, this, I think, might be the more familiar part of this letter. A lot of good lessons have been preached through the years by smarter folks than I am on, you know, the idea of the old man, the new man, and sin and what that looks like and how we're to put that off and put on something else, and that's right. But it's also important for us to remember that that's laid upon a foundation. Remember who you are. Remember what's been done for you. Remember what you've been called to. And recognize the fact that you're not just anybody. You are a child of God. You're a son of God, a child of God. that we in the heavenly places sit with Christ. You see, a right to the Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven. And so it's unthinkable that because of who we are, we could just live like the world does. It's not just a list of rules. There's nothing arbitrary about this. God calls us to be one after His own nature. And so with that in mind, it seems to me to put more power behind the words that we read, for example, in chapter 4 and verse 31, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake has forgiven you. And of course we divide the book into chapters and verses, but it just continues the thought of the old translation. 5:1 reads, be ye therefore followers of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also hath loved us, and hath given himself for us an offering and a sacrifice unto God for a sweet-smelling savor. But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not be once named among you as becometh saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. He starts out by talking about things like bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking and malice, all malice. You've got to put that away. You take it off, you leave it behind, it be removed from you. Like someone would take off a filthy garment. So you are putting aside, putting away from you this type of behavior. Bitterness. Bitterness, pikra, is a word that starts out in reference to taste. We know what it means to taste something bitter. It's unpleasant. Now, to most people, there are a few oddballs who like grapefruit. That's your problem. But generally speaking, we don't want that. Spit that out of our mind. We understand that there's a sharpness to it that's unpleasant. Now here he brings that over, and we have done that, to our feeling, our emotion. And he says there's some people who have a sharp, pungent, bitter feeling towards somebody's, toward life. And he said it must not be so with you. One fellow described it as a smoldering resentment, an unwillingness to forgive, harsh feelings, a bitter frame of mind. I get bitter about a guy and he just cannot do anything right. It's just that kind of an intense hatred, I think, is what it is. It's interesting, isn't it? You can read about righteous anger in the Bible, but I don't think you ever read about righteous bitterness, do you? Bitterness is just bad. And it can take hold of us. It's a choice we make. And if we choose it, it leaves us, I believe, scarred. And I believe it leaves us separated from God. By the way, a hard life is no excuse for that. People sometimes say, well, this guy had such a hard experience in life. I'm sure it may be more difficult for him than it would be a guy like me who suffered so much less. But the Lord says, leave that behind. You can, obviously. He wouldn't ask us to do it otherwise. So this is the question for us to answer to ourselves today. Am I bitter? Anybody I'm bitter toward? You haven't learned that from Christ. He said, put away all wrath and anger, two words here that are used often in the Scriptures, and translated wrath and anger back and forth. They are slightly different words, I think. One of them suggests the idea, the word here for thumos literally comes from the idea of somebody breathing hard. That kind of anger, fierce wrath. And then orge is the more settled kind of wrath. There's a righteous anger, that is true. But we're not talking about that here, are we? We're talking about an anger that is not set for a righteous cause, not handled in a righteous way. It's when, I think we could say, you just let anger grab hold of the steering wheel of your mind. At least that's the figure I think of. If you have never done that, you ought to be preaching today instead of me. But I will promise you that most of us have had occasions we look back on with great shame in which we just let our temper rule us for a time. And words that come out of our mouth and actions and thoughts and looks that are not from love. They're from hatred. Anger controls us in that moment. What Paul said is, you've got to put that away. When a man would say in response, well, I just have a bad temper. That's not any more of an excuse than you say, well, I'm just a fornicator. I'm just a thief. I just can't help it. Yes, you can. I've got to help it. But I know this, and you know it too, it will not happen accidentally. It only comes through, what did the Lord once say? You have to cast out this demon through prayer and fasting. Sometimes it's going to take prayer and fasting. It's certainly going to take effort and work. If I recognize that this is my problem, it may not be everybody's problem, but if temper is my problem, I'll tell you, it's going to have to be defeated by consistent prayer. It's going to have to be defeated by putting the Word of God in our mind. It's going to have to be defeated by a determination that today I know something is going to tempt me to make me angry in an unrighteous way. And when that moment comes, whenever it comes, Lord, help me to remember who I am. I think it's going to take that kind of specific, conscious effort if I'm ever going to make progress. But the idea now to be just sitting back and saying, well, that's just the way I am, that just will not cut it, will it? You remember the old saying, I'm sure you've heard this. Let me see if I can get it right. Somebody says, watch out when you pray for patience, because the Lord will send you trouble. You've heard that, something like that. The things that might disappoint us, that might anger us even, are not pleasant, but it might be an opportunity for me to show growth. I think it would help me more if I thought about every day that way. Whatever it is that disappoints me, whatever it is that might be unfair, whatever it is that I think is, certainly would be usually the cause of an unrighteous anger, I'm going to use that as an opportunity to say, with the Lord's help, I'm going to show I'm a different person than I used to be. Anger and wrath, you got to put that away, Paul says to all of us. And clamor, in the old translation, the word clamor, different terms are used for that, I guess, in the more modern translations. The word is one of those onomatopoeic words, which is a fancy way of saying it's a word that is created by what it sounds like the word buzz is a classic example of that. We call it buzzing because that's what it sounds like. And this is a word krage in the Greek that sounds sort of like a crow squawking. It's a loud noise. Generally, most people consider the squawking of a crow to be unpleasant. And if you get a bunch of them together, it can be quite hard to ignore. And you just picture from that sound in your mind the idea of two people going at each other in loud, angry words, shouting and yelling at each other. Here is bitterness and unrighteous anger that now is coming through my mouth and the volume is turned up loud. You ever had somebody just yell at you? It's not pleasant, is it? God forbid. You ever done that to somebody else? We all have seen this too. Somebody created many years ago, I guess it was old when we got married, Donna and I got married, that was a few years ago. This list of rules, how you treat your spouse. I don't know who all came up with it, but one of them I remember said, never yell at each other unless the house is on fire. You've seen things like that. It's a good point. Is there any good to come out of yelling at somebody in anger? Ever? A soft answer turns away wrath. If I've got to shout you down, I'm not going to be doing anything for the Lord in that. I may do something for my own ego. Put that away. It's not hard to find in the world, but put it away. Loud outcries of anger, of bickering, evil speaking is really the word blasphemy. Speaking against someone, and it carries with it the idea when it relates to God sometimes, obviously. People sin by blaspheming God. They sin by blaspheming other men, other people, other humans. You know what the word indicates, as one fellow said, all kind of slander. The more deliberate habit of running down their character, exciting an evil feeling against them in the minds of others. It's those words that we use to tear down somebody else. Whatever our motive is, it's not from God. You didn't learn that from Christ. Is that a habit that we have? Malice. That's an ugly word, isn't it? In fact, the word just comes from the idea of evil, kakia. And so malice, evil speaking, ill will, a desire to injure. It's the equivalent of wishing evil, whether a more pronounced or in a latent, half-conscious form. It's that hatred centered on somebody else. We wish them ill. There's never an excuse for that, by the way. The Lord said, love your enemies. Bless those that curse you. Do good to those that hate you. I didn't say it's easy. And I didn't say that I always do it well. I know this, I must do it well. Paul said this is the hard work of being a Christian. Because of who you are, you have to recognize that God expects something of you. And part of that something is you've got to put malice out of your life. If there's anybody here I've got it in for in the world, any of us here, if that spirit resides in our heart, it must be removed and replaced with, back to our text, be ye kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake has forgiven you. And so kindness, it's applied thoughtfulness. I like that definition. It's not on the chart, but I like that definition of kindness. It's that spirit that desires to be helpful, that looks for the good of others. It's coupled with the idea of being tender-hearted, full of pity, some translations say, sympathetic, compassionate, having a heart for other people, sympathizing, putting ourselves in the other guy's place, and forgiving. Well, there's a big word. Forgiving. It's a form of the word grace. You know, there's something interesting about grace. We've got Brother Holly coming here in a few weeks. I heard Brother Holly make this point one time in a lesson that stuck with me. He said, you know, oftentimes we will define grace as unmerited favor. I've done that. You may have too. And that's not a bad definition. It is unmerited favor. But the point he made, and I thought it was so true, it's more than unmerited favor. You know, we have our little children, and I'll tell you what we do for them is we sacrifice for them. We get up in the middle of the night for them. We provide for them. We do all these things. What did they do to merit that other than being born and being kin to us? Well, nothing really. That's unmerited favor. That is true. But the grace of God is greater than that. It's not just unmerited favor. It's unmerited favor bestowed on those who merit punishment. That little child didn't do anything to deserve the good, but he hadn't done anything to deserve bad either. But I do. And when I think about the grace of God that way, it ought to help me to deal with other people. Even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. I like what this one fellow wrote. He said, God has showed himself kind, tender-hearted, forgiving. It is but just that you shall in turn do so to your fellow men who have not erred against you to the degree that you have erred against God. So let me take that with me as I leave the building today. Maybe that'll help me be more patient with people, because other people are patient with me, and God surely is patient with me. That's what it means to be a Christian. That's what it means to learn Christ. And then in chapter 5, verse 3, but fornication and all uncleanness and covetousness, let it not be named once among you as become saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. This idea of not being named, it doesn't mean that you can't talk about the subject. You know, Paul just lists them here. But of course what it means is let it not be named in the sense of being accepted. Don't speak of it lightly. Don't in any way think this is acceptable behavior under any circumstance. I know I've shared this with some of you before, but years ago, it's been nearly 40 years ago now that I think about it. It's a long time. I left my job and took advantage of an opportunity up in southern West Virginia to try to learn the work of preaching. And the church there was kind enough to take me in and help me out, and learned a lot that year. I got to meet a fellow who was very well known at the time. He's still around, Melvin Curry. And spent a little time with him. He was visiting up there. And here I am in my early 20s, and I'm just trying to learn this work of preaching and trying to look to the future. And I asked him, I said, Brother Curry, what do you think is going to be the greatest problem the church will face in the next 20 or 30 years? Thought that was a real good question, you know. And I want to know his answer. And what he said to me, I will not forget. He said, I think just plain old immorality, he said. He said, that's always the problem. That's always what it comes back to. I was expecting some exotic false teaching or some other. He said, no, it's just, generally speaking, the church is more troubled by plain old immorality. And I think looking back all these years later, he's about right. That is the fight. It's not new, but it surely is the fight. Fornication. Sleeping with somebody you don't have a right to. And you don't have a right to them if you're not married to them. And if it's not a lawful marriage. And so the idea of fornication, letting sexual lust rule, instead of anger being in the driver's seat, now that lust is in the driver's seat, and we don't care what's right. We're just going to do this. And we're going to serve the devil and shame God in the process. He said, you cannot do that. That's not who you are. All uncleanness. We use the word, we don't use it much, but I don't anyway, but the word catharsis. If somebody goes through a catharsis, you ever heard somebody use that word? The idea of maybe somebody's having a lot of trouble and they go somewhere and they'll, you know, I'm mocking a little bit, but sitting under a tree, they come to peace with themselves. They cleanse themselves of all their troubled thinking, you know, and they come to a point. We call that a catharsis. We borrow that from the Greeks. And the word here is the word catharsis with a negative on it. And it means here's somebody who's not cleansed. They're not clean. They're filled with all kinds of dark things and confusion. Morally impure. One fellow commenting on this word of uncleanness suggested this too may mean immoral acts, but perhaps it can also include impure pictures, obscene books, and other suggestive materials that go along with lives of indecency and that feed the fire of passions. Pornography is such a huge business. The porn industry in America makes more than McDonald's. It's a huge industry. It's a problem. It's a problem for young men. It's a problem for young women. It's a problem for old men. It's a problem in our country. It's a problem in the church. And he said, you've got to put away from yourself all uncleanness and all the things that lead us to sin and that deliver us to lust. He also mentions another kind of lust, and that is covetousness. The word that he used here just simply means to hold more and more and more, and it's never enough. This is not a political forum, but doesn't it cross your mind sometimes you see people in government, in high government, old people with one foot in the grave, and it seems like the only thought that they have is, what can I steal tomorrow? Without a thought in their head about how they're going to have to face God soon. Now, I'll tell you, whether that's me or somebody else, it's just amazing how we can be so caught up in getting something that we fail to recognize that we're going to have to answer to God. You know, the thing that covetousness does not do and will not do, it will not recognize God's place. To the covetous man, things are number one. There can only be not one number one. And the Lord very directly, in Matthew 6, we have it recorded, made it clear no man can serve two masters. He will either hate the one and love the other, or hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. You know how that applies to me? When I've got a decision to make, and the choice is I can either take this place, choose this course that will allow me to grow as a Christian, to serve God, to serve my family, or I can make more money. I think I'll take the money and worry about the rest later. That's what covetousness is. That's a big word, but it's a very practical and very dangerous spirit. The Lord help us to never put anything before Him. Filthiness is another general term that can be thought of as shameful, disgraceful, obscene, anything contrary to purity, obscenity in act or gestures. It's a very common spirit. Turn on the television for about 10 minutes. Just about in any direction, you'll hear that kind of language, that kind of humor. Foolish talking fits right with that. To talk about sin of the spirit of a fool, as one fellow put it, and I think that's pretty good. Somebody who gloats and jests over his own or his neighbor's undoing. The talk of fools. The empty conversation, including gutter language. Godless speech without forethought and wisdom. It's the way the world talks. The world can say more ungodly things in 10 minutes than somebody who's not so twisted could think of in a lifetime. And we have to include this word, the idea of jesting here, which is not, of course, talking about having a sense of humor, but it's that coarse jesting. The world can take anything and make something dirty out of it. Nearly anything. You could just about say good morning to some people, and they'd find a way to make that some double entendre and think they're clever. And folks make a good living doing that, by the way. A lot of money. Because they have a way of somehow twisting everything into something dirty and defiled. To the impure, everything's impure. Now, don't let, Paul said, that influence, it's always been there. It was there in the first century. It was there before there was TikTok. It was there before there was television, before the internet. But what he said is, don't let that shape the way you talk, the way you think. Put it away. Turn it off. Refuse it. Such things are not convenient, the old translation says. They're out of place. They're totally inappropriate. Rather, and there's always a substitute. There's always something to put in place there for the good when you get rid of the bad, isn't there? He says, let there be giving of thanks. Some of the modern translations take this phrase this way. Don't use dirty or foolish or filthy words. Instead, say how thankful you are. Obscene, flippant, Vulgar talk is totally inappropriate. Instead, let there be thanksgiving. In place of them, giving thanks. How about that? How about I make it my goal that instead of engaging in low talk or low humor, I leave people better than I found them. That I make it my ambition to somehow find a way to say before people, before unbelievers, how thankful we are to God, what we owe to God, to plant that seed in their mind, that we are those creatures who owe so much to our Creator. Now, finishing this morning, in chapter 5 and verse 6, let no man deceive you with vain words, for because of these things come the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience. Be not ye therefore partakers with them. That's a chilling verse, is it not? He said, do not be deceived. How many times does Paul say that? Isn't that 1 Corinthians 6 says the same thing? Romans 1 says the same thing. Do not be deceived. I know that the whole world is walking that way and talks that way and thinks that way. They're headed for the wrath of God. Don't join them. Don't be deceived. Live differently. Expect to have to live differently. Because where they're headed is the wrath and punishment of God for eternity. Ye were sometimes darkness, in verse 8. But now you're light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness and righteousness and truth, proving what is acceptable unto the Lord. He says in there that you were at one time darkness. We're not people who have never been troubled by sin. We're not folks who stand above somebody else looking down on them. We're people who have been fighting this fight, but we're fighting. And with God's help, we've made progress. Remember who you are, he says, and walk as children of light and show the fruit of the Spirit in our lives. Another old saying that you've heard, it's a great question. If it was a crime to be a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? You've heard that. That's a great question. And here I am on the job site, and the kind of talk that's going on there it's just not what it ought to be. And the places that people go after work, or the place they go for recreation, the music they listen to, it's unholy, it's ungodly. And I'm there in the middle of them, claiming to be different. You got to show difference. And that's the task that all of us have. Prove it. Prove what is acceptable unto the Lord. Whether he means by that we need to be careful in our practice, or whether he means by that we can in our lives show God's way is better, or that we can, as we just suggested, show in our lives that we are different. It comes down to the testing and the action, not just the talk. Proving it. The word comes from the idea of testing a metal to make sure that it is genuine. Somebody wants to sell you a little ounce of gold. I don't know anything about buying and selling gold, but one thing I think is a good idea, we might want to see if that's really gold. It might be copper. It might be paint. So this life tests us, and we've got to stand up to the test and show that we're made out of the stuff that God has given. Then finally, verse 11. After all that he said there, he offers this thought, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. I can remember as a kid hearing Irvin Lee preach in a meeting, and he read this verse, and I had not been a Christian very long, and he said, you'll read the Bible from one end to the other, you'll hardly find a more difficult command than this command. Because what it requires us to do, he said, was not only to not partake in evil, but to condemn it. And I'd say this to the folks here, to our young folks, and I'd say it to the rest of us. You'll find through the years it's a difficult thing to have the courage to take a stand. Not just quietly slip by and just get by, but to be unashamed to let people know who you are and why. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. For it is a shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret. Let the man who serves the devil be ashamed. If you serve Christ, don't be ashamed of that. That's a great point to end on this morning. It's time for us to take our stand. And I'll tell you, the world's making it pretty easy for us in one sense, because it's becoming more and more bold. Don't be ashamed to make a stand. I say that to me and to you. May the Lord help us not to let him down when the time comes, when the crunch comes. We have not so learned Christ. That's not who we are. We cannot be that. And so let our lives proclaim Christ as well as our mouths. I appreciate your kind attention this morning. If you're here today and you're not a child of God, why not now make your stand by obeying the gospel of Christ? If you're here as one who, as a child of God, has not been faithful to the promise you made, make that right with him. And if we can help you in any way, please let us know how. While we do stand and while we sing, will you come? Almost persuaded.